welcome to Left of the Projector. I am your host, Evan, back again with another film discussion from the left. You can subscribe to the show wherever you're listening to it right now. You could leave a rating and a review. That would be most appreciative. And you can also find this podcast on every platform pretty much at Left of the Projector Pod. And this week on the show, my guest and I will be talking about one of this year's frontrunners for Best Picture Academy Award, among others, and that is none other than Christopher Nolan's Oppenheimer. The list of actors is kind of too long for me to name them all in this movie, so suffice to say there's lots of people you recognize if you've seen this movie. And my guests this week are Nathan, the host of Schizophrenic Reads, as well as Book Talker. Also on the show, I have back Justin Clark, who's a public historian and serves as the Digital Initiatives Director at the Indiana Historical Bureau as part of the Indiana State Library. He also has a podcast called Red Reviews, which you can find on YouTube and podcast platforms. And I guess in full disclosure, Nathan and I have been talking about this movie in particular to discuss, I think since last summer when it came out.
Yeah, since it came out, I was like, please get me on the podcast for this one. I was begging.
And so I think so that's, it's been on my mind for a long time. I saw it in the theater in IMAX, and then I watched it again. And I think maybe a good way to kick off the discussion would be, and this I guess could also be your impressions of the movie in general, but I thought, wondering if you thought the film itself was a success. And I guess by success, I mean, as the audience, do you think it gave them enough insight into Dr. Oppenheimer, the man, Dr. Oppenheimer, the Manhattan Project, the aftermath, kind of the history that, landed on the U.S. after the successful, I'm going to put that in quotation marks, bombing of Japan to, also in quotation marks, end World War II. So I don't know what you thought about that.
Well, I guess I can go first. I think that in general, I think that the film is, in my opinion, sort of an unreserved masterpiece. I think that it might be Christopher Nolan's best movie. It's certainly my most favorite movie of his since Interstellar, which I also quite like. And I think that it does really get to the heart of, in a lot of ways, to the core of who Dr. Robert Oppenheimer was, who was this deeply intense, mercurial, complicated figure whose sort of is a hinge point of the 20th century and arguably one of the most important figures of the 20th century and of all of human history in terms of the implications of the atomic bomb. I also saw it in the theater, loved it then, rewatched it this weekend. And I am just struck not just by the emotional core of the film, but also about the technical aspects of the film, which we can get into a little bit too, that I thought were kind of rather brilliant. It's very rare these days, at least for me, as somebody who's been watching movies for decades, and to watch something on screen that's brand new and kind of be like, wow, like genuinely impressed by it in a way that other stuff doesn't leave you with, at least for me. So, I absolutely loved it. And I do think it's a very, faithful portrayal of who Robert Oppenheimer was.
Yeah, I think from the historical context, I would give it just the flying colors, because I think it is it's pretty historical accurate, like to the real life story and stuff, which I think is important. But I also think there's, I don't know, just as like the movie going experience, it's such a success because I think it is genuinely a phenomenal movie. And I say that as someone that's been pretty skeptical of Christopher Nolan's work. I haven't really loved any of the this newer stage of his projects from Interstellar and Tenet and stuff. And I've just been okay on them, but it was phenomenal. Artistically, stylistically, and narratively it was such a phenomenal movie. And I think more than that, I think there's just it got people excited to watch a World War II biopic, which is just not something that we've really seen. And I think the story was handled with enough caution and care and sensitivity that it had productive conversations happening out of it, which I think says a lot more than, a lot of the other World War II movies that we've been inundated with over the last 20 years. So yeah, I think it's just something that was great for starting conversations, and also just for the cinema landscape is such a success because high budget but non superhero movies, like I think their success is an incredibly important part of like the future of movies. And to me, I was just, happy it made 1 billion. Like it's a weird thing to cheer for, but I mean, when it's like competing against Miss Marvel or whatever the newest Marvel thing is, you're like, I'm just glad it's not that one that everyone's talking about.
Yeah, for sure. And I would agree as far as the moving going experience of seeing it in IMAX. I mean, I'm sure if I'd seen it not in IMAX, it still would have been just as good, but it was just a very one of the most visually interesting Christopher Nolan movies. For me, before this, my favorite movie of his, which maybe it's not a common one, is The Prestige. I think Nathan and I, we talked about this when we were discussing the Oscars just in general. That was always one of my Nolan movies that I always really enjoyed. But I found even from the beginning of the movie, you already have the kind of the imagery of like the destruction and like what we know will happen. And it's spoiler. Everyone watches this movie, they know that Oppenheimer and the Manhattan Project succeed. They bomb Japan, but I think that what most people don't know until they saw this is what led to it, what was at stake, what was kind of put upon Oppenheimer. There's lots of pressure and kind of unspoken, you need to do this, or I wouldn't say or else, but you have to do this for your country. And I think maybe one of the ways to kind of talk about the movie. I know you both read the book that this is based on. So as you mentioned, Nathan, this is based on a book, and you both said, I think beforehand, that it's pretty accurate to both the book and kind of we don't need to go through like point by point or anything, but generally speaking, you would both say it's pretty accurate.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's been over a year since I read the book, so it's not like super fresh on my mind, but it does get a lot of the narrative points correct. I think obviously the book is like 850 pages, so it's pretty expansive. Specifically, it focuses a lot more on Oppenheimer, I think, like pre-Manhattan Project, and really goes into like the history of Oppenheimer, which was, I wouldn't say skated over in the movies. It's just because that's not like the primary narrative focus of it. So I don't like, that's not a criticism. But yeah, I think it also has a lot more intricacies of the later years post Manhattan Project that we don't see in the movie, but that's also narratively accurate and accurate in terms of theme. And so, like, to me, I give it just a complete pass in that regard, because I think it did get some of those really fine points of how we should talk about Oppenheimer and how we should view it.
Sorry, y'all. Are you guys having technical issues? I'm having a little technical issues on my end. I apologize.
It's just for me, a brief second there, just toward the end. So it might have been all of us, maybe.
Okay. Yeah, no, I agree with Nathan. One of my little things I do in my book, in my show, is actually show the book. So I'm going to do that. So the book is American Prometheus.
And the book, that would have been helpful.
And by Kai Bird and Martin Sherwin. Just for context, the book project started with Martin Sherwin. He worked on this book for 25 years. Kai Bird came onto the project later. Kai Bird is probably one of the preeminent political sort of narrative historians. He also does a lot of biographical work of like espionage and spies. So I think it really ties well into the story of Robert Oppenheimer. Does a very good job of balancing, sort of teaching you a little bit about the science as well as teaching you about the sort of the political aspects of it. I was actually surprised at how political the book was, which I was like, thank you. This is like the first like book about science or scientific fear I'd ever read that was like very political. I was like, this is great. Because usually they're not. But I think Oppenheimer's story is so overt. The movie does an excellent job of condensing a lot of the big high points of the book into a very condensed, and I mean by condensed I mean 3-hour movie, but it is extremely condensed of a person's entire life and their influence on the 20th century. So yeah, no, I think it's a masterful book. So I think when you're pulling from source material that's this good, it's kind of hard to not have it be good.
Yeah, and this is unrelated to the book itself, but I think for people who are listening, we kind of have been chatting about, different topics and theories on this book. And I think both Nathan and I think way back when we were first talking about the movie, you had proposed a theory, and I'll let you explain it because I haven't really got to hear it. I think we've been waiting to this moment. As you kind of talked about this movie as a film about climate change, mentioned, well, I guess we'll go through both of these. I think they're both important aspects. Talking about this is kind of the beginning of the American national security state and the consequences of that. And I think we could maybe start with with you, Nathan, and then I think the national security state and that kind of filters through the entire movie, and it kind of the narrative I think is very easily can be used to trace that what we have even today 75 years later.
Yeah, I think to me, like the reading of this as a climate change movie, it's like a few different points, but I think also that's kind of the lane that Christopher Nolan has been talking about in his last several films. He's talking about the future, and he's talking about like the existential crises that we're facing, and how can we like go backwards, and not in a like literal sense, because like his movies take place in that, but like how can we like conceive of what we have done that has led us to this point. And I think that's like the big kind of philosophical question of Oppenheimer. And Oppenheimer obviously exists at this like historical precedent of like the change in history, and we talk about like the change of the nuclear age, but it's also, yes, it's the change into like the national security state. It's the change of, I think it's almost like industrial capitalism 2.0. It's like this new stage of capitalism because it's kind of filtered through and exacerbated by the Cold War, that it just becomes an entity that is completely different than what it had been in the past. And so Oppenheimer is this hinge point, and I think the way that I see it in the movie is like his first like quandary of like he's struggling to understand what is happening. He's like looking at raindrops, he's looking at like the literal weather, and he's like trying to understand what is happening around him. And by the end of the movie, he has this reckoning, and this is like the spoiler for the movie, but I'm gonna guess most people have probably seen it. But the film kind of ends on this like really destructive, dour note of like how we should come to regret the things that we have put forth in the world. And I think like that is really like, to me, that's Oppenheimer is, he's kind of this manifestation of how we should view what we have done. And it's kind of this reflective dread, because there's just this sense that like we might not have had a choice, but maybe if at some point we did, we really should have like actually understood. And I think the whole kind of story of Oppenheimer, especially as it exists in history, but I think the movie does a really good job, is Oppenheimer is just like this kind of ignorant character that is extremely confident and extremely smart, but really just like critically misses key components in order to like not only retain power, but also retain relevancy. And that's kind of Oppenheimer fades away. And that's like where we're at now, is like there were maybe alternative histories that could have come out like during the Cold War and during the just like complete expansion into like the petrol states that we have now. And those decisions never happened. And now we're living with the consequences. And I think to me, that reading is just so concise, because it starts with the weather and it ends with, yeah, we've really fucked up, and we should understand that. We should know that we made so many different decisions to get here, but we should have seen it coming the whole time. And that's exactly the reading that I had like the first time I watched it, and I watched it again, and there's just so much imagery of like weather and nature and like the science, and not particularly like the it's not like atoms bouncing off each other, it's flames, it's weather patterns, it's nature. And that's, yeah, it haunts me. And maybe I'm just too climate change pilled because I read like way too much on the subject, but that's the only way that I've really like fully read this movie.
Well, that's really interesting. And so when you're sort of talking about like climate change pill, that's kind of how I feel. So as somebody who studies political history and American history, that's kind of probably how I got to my read, which is that, because I don't think you're wrong. I think there's all of that there. I mean, especially I'm always very deeply moved by the sequences in, Los Alamos, especially during the Trinity test. They're holding off the test for rain. It's like sometimes you can have all four seasons here in New Mexico, the intense cold, the intense heat, all of that. I think that's very, very relevant. And I think that that's a really interesting read. I know people have also done the same read with artificial intelligence, which is kind of the other thing. Although I think that the climate change thing is a little bit more important. I think some of the artificial intelligence doomerism is more PR than reality, but But anyway, so my read of the movie is really that, J. Robert Oppenheimer and I've kind of we talked about in the Citizen Kane discussion about how that film is sort of a good extrapolation of the the concept of the American century sort of losing its innocence. And I think that Oppenheimer is another read of that too, where he is this character who genuinely is moved for, I think, true, in some respects, early on, very moral reasons, later on for more pragmatic reasons, and to try to either make the bomb work so that it never has to be used again, or if we're going to have a world where these things exist, that we have to mitigate their effects as much as possible and build policy around it. But the problem was that he was challenging deep assumptions at the heart of the sort of national security state as it was developing. That he was sort of a thorn in the side of people like Lewis Strauss and John Foster Dulles, who was Secretary of State in the 1950s, who and others who very deeply believed that in order for the world to be safe, that the United States basically had to be on a permanent wartime footing, which is something that it had never really been before. I mean, the United States had always had an active military, but usually after conflicts, the military would sort of pare down. That was what happened in World War One. That's what happened in Spanish America. That doesn't happen. And what gets replaced by the traditional sort of foreign policy, national security apparatus is something a little bit more permanent. People today call it the deep state. I don't really like that term. The one I like to use more is what I would call permanent government. These are people who are bureaucrats who were never elected. You probably don't even know their names, but they have deep influences on not just policymakers, but on the public, the threats. And so, I think that Robert Oppenheimer is a figure who is sort of caught in these currents of the development of the national security state, the development of this permanent government, the rise of espionage and spying in the U.S. government apparatus in the 20th century, and most importantly, McCarthyism and the McCarthy era, because it could be argued that Oppenheimer was probably the most high-level or high-profile casualty of McCarthyism. What I see with him is sort of that destruction of a older conception of America and the creation of a new one, built in the image of these national security forces that have deep assumptions built into them that cannot be challenged, about the primacy of U.S. power, about the universal evil of the Soviet Union or any other communist states, that we must fight monolithic communism. And I think that he deeply regretted a lot of what he was involved in and tried to rectify it in the post, Los Alamos years, but was unfortunately unable to do that. And there were forces much, much larger than him. And so I think it speaks volumes about if that the United States government could destroy the life and the reputation of the man who was the father of the atomic bomb, one of the most celebrated scientists and public intellectuals of the 20th century, they could pretty much do it to anyone. And I think that's a very dire warning for all of us.
Yeah, I think when I was thinking about how Oppenheimer throughout the movie and his sort of, naivete or ignorance about it, as a scientist, I think everything he did was focused around the science, not the math, the other people who are actually testing it. And he was completely unaware about I think even the power of the government in some way, which is almost hard to fathom as someone who's so smart and is a brilliant scientist, a brilliant person, but it was just completely naive about the power of the government. He never even really, which I think we should also talk about, like the communist witch hunt, McCarthyist kind of aspect, which is what later leads to him losing his security clearance, among other more political reasons. But I don't think he understood that giving money to like the Spanish, during the war in Spain and any of these things, I don't think he understood the implications of these things and just was, these are the things that I, as he mentions, like, oh, I've read Capital, all 3 volumes, and then proceeds to get it completely wrong. I don't know that the little joke they have in there, I don't know who that was for or whatever, but I don't know. I just think it's amazing to me that someone that smart just doesn't have. It's almost like you think of someone like they have street smarts but don't have book smarts. He's the opposite. He has all the book smarts in the world, but has no street smart. And they hammer it home constantly.
Yeah, Nathan, go ahead.
Well, and I think like it's kind of like how I've been perceiving, like, especially in like the last few months of like kind of like liberal mentality of governance. It's like there's things that like liberals and stuff can just be like a little bit progressive on, and you can like look at their view on politics and be like, you're close to getting it. Like you have several of the keys to understanding it, but you haven't fully unlocked like how to view what we are living through, or how to view like the complex problem. And I think like that's exactly kind of how I perceive of Oppenheimer is kind of this political sentimentality in which he was never able to go far enough in order to like actually, I think, dissect what was happening. And that political naivete is, I mean, I think what the movie does like in a really phenomenal manner, because especially like reading the book or like studying Oppenheimer just like a little bit more, like I've always referred to him as this like he's a himbo. Like he's incredibly charming. The movie doesn't go far enough into just how slutty he was. Like he was a cool guy. And he could have been like the greatest, public lecturer of the 20th century, but he just got brought up into like a political system which destroyed him because he didn't know what he was getting into.
Yeah, they mention at least two of his affairs. I mean, obviously Jean Tatlock is the main one, but then the other one is the blonde lady who's at the party. They only kind of allude to it, and then there's a passing line about it later. It's not terribly clear, but yeah. There's some interesting components about Oppenheimer that is sort of left out of the movie that's in the book that I was really kind of like, oh, this is super fascinating to me. So, as somebody who studies the history of free thought and the history of secular movements in the 19th and the 20th centuries, Oppenheimer's a product of it. So he grew up in the ethical culture tradition in New York City. His parents were Jewish European immigrants. And he grows up in this very kind of isolated, very cultivated environment where, the ethical culture school, which sort of grew out of sort of, reform, I think always permeated his thinking. This is why he's the guy who can, do the, he can go tete-a-tete with any sort of physicist, but then he also reads like the Bhagavad Gita and T.S. Eliot, and he's a man who's deeply involved in ideas. And I think that for most of his life, up until the 1930s, he didn't really think that much about politics. It wasn't really on his radar. And it wasn't until the Depression that sort of changes, when he learns about the Spanish Civil War, and then he starts donating money to that cause, and sort of becomes more politically involved. But again, he's somebody who, we can always get into the discussion of like, was he actually a member of the Communist Party? I kind of lean on the side that he was not. I think that he was what you would call a fellow traveler, somebody who was never an official member of the party, but gave money to their causes and like supported a little member. The evidence is very kind of murky on that. I know Martin Sherwin, after he published the book with Kai Bird, mentioned that there was some evidence that maybe he was. But that's kind of what I read him as. I think he's a fiercely independent man who has a fiercely independent mind. And so I think that is both a strength of his, in that I think it allowed him to be so intellectually brilliant, but it was also very stifling in that it didn't allow him to see some of the things that were fairly obvious about the ways in which the government were going to try to go after him for some basic things to him that didn't seem that big a deal. But in the context of, the Red Scare, seem, I think, probably, in hindsight to him, probably a problem, probably a major problem.
And I think like a political analogy that I don't think is perfect. I'm not saying it's like a one-to-one comparison, but I think it's like a really helpful way to like kind of understand, because it's just something we've all lived through, is like very much in how I've kind of viewed Barack Obama's presidency, is like a man with like just insane talent and charisma and ability to like work with people and like be like someone that the public trusts, and someone that is like has this confidence man kind of mentality almost, but like actually fundamentally does not understand what he's up against. And like I think so many people have kind of lost faith in politics in like the last 15 years, and I think a lot of that stems from like the promises made and not kept by Obama's presidency. And like, that is something like we are still kind of like currently reckoning with. And like, I think in that same frame of someone that like did kind of broadly understand some of the political philosophy on most sides, but still like could not really understand deeply and truly like what was at stake. And that's kind of just like how I've kind of viewed and how I've tried to explain to like some friends about how to understand Oppenheimer, because I think it's a pretty concrete example that I think most people in like real life are like, oh, okay, I get that.
Yeah, that's a much better, that's a good analogy. And I think as you were talking, Justin, about like a fellow traveler, it also took me back to our episode on Citizen Kane as Orson Welles is like, he's vaguely left, but I wouldn't really say he was like a communist. Whereas the same thing with Oppenheimer, I think he understood, in some sense, political theory. To some sense, he read Marx. He had some understanding of it. He felt like fascism is bad. We should give money to the other people, but not really taking it to like any next step. He didn't need to take it to the next step because his life is focused on science. It didn't need to go deeper. If he wasn't a brilliant scientist, maybe he does, something else. The guy who can read Sanskrit or whatever, he could have applied his knowledge to almost whatever he studied. He could learn German almost instantly, like in brief months or whatever, could do those things. But this also leads me to a question, since we're kind of talking about him as the man, is what do we think, or what does the movie posit we think about what Oppenheimer actually believes? Like, what is his actual core beliefs? Because in my reading through a lot of the way that Nolan presents it, I think it's a later speech. I'm see if I can find it. I think maybe it's his wife Kitty or someone who says, like, what do you actually believe in? I think they actually might use those exact words. It's kind of unclear what he really believes in, like what his actual foundational core morality is from, because he's grapples with the post-bomb that's killed thousands of people, and the very moving scene where he's hearing the pounding of of the people's feet in the gymnasium type of rec room after the bombs have been dropped and they're celebrating. It's haunting him, but I just don't know what it is he believes, or what we're meant to think he believes.
There's a very interesting passage that Kai Bird and Martin Sherwin quote in American Prometheus from Oppenheimer's book, which I think is called like The Open Mind or The Independent Mind, where Oppenheimer has this really interesting meditation on reason and power, and ultimately he kind of comes down on the importance of style. So if you'll permit me, I'm just going to read this real quick, because I think this explains a lot. So he says, the problem of doing justice to the implicit, the imponderable, and the unknown is of course not unique in politics. It is always with us in science. It is with us in the most trivial of personal affairs, and it is one of the great problems of writing and all forms of art. The means by which it is solved is sometimes called style, affirmation with limitation, and with humility. It is style which makes it possible to act effectively, but not absolutely. It is style which, in the domain of foreign policy, enables us to find a harmony between the pursuit of ends essential to us and the regard for the views, the sensibilities, the aspirations of those to whom the problem may appear in another light. It is style which is the difference. It is the style which is the deference that actually defers to reason. I think this is like fascinating. I think that gets to the heart of it, which is that this is a man who is deeply, deeply pragmatic and understands the relationship between what you believe, what are your core convictions, and how those are then relayed to policymakers and to the general public. If you look at him in public interviews, he's always very poised, and he often doesn't use ums. He doesn't have like cut off sentences. He often speaks like he writes. So he's a very calculated man. And so in terms of the beliefs, I think a part of that is the core of that humanist tradition he came out of, the ethical cultural school. Some of that's there. But also part of it is good old-fashioned American pragmatism. We're talking William James, John Dewey. Like it's very much sometimes you do things which may seem on the surface horrible, but serve a larger purpose. and it's the finessing of those which he would determine as style. He's using style in kind of an idiosyncratic way, but basically he's talking about how one communicates effectively both science and politics and its relationship to policy. And to me, that's a real core component of who he is that, for as much as he is a scientist, he's in respect, even though he's not elected, he's a politician. And so I think that you could take that quote and also apply it to Barack Obama. I think your allusion to Barack Obama is brilliant. I think that's absolutely right. And I think that quote applies to Obama as much as it does to Oppenheimer.
And I think I think like one of the most frustrating parts of like, it's the, always looking back at history because you have the answers or you know how it turned out is one of the frustrating but also like enlightening parts of studying history. And I think with Oppenheimer, it is just like kind of almost surreal, like hold on professionalism, like which he maintained until he finally just was so defeated that he kind of walked off into the sunset. And like there is a alternate point in Oppenheimer's life. Like I think about this a lot. If he truly had become the American public villain, if he had truly like used his platform to like speak out about like the injustice and like what was happening and like how probably he was privately perceiving like the evilness in which like was, and I use that term broadly, but like he saw so much and there was no way that he was completely like ignorant of it, but he never let it show in public. And that's just one of the most fascinating parts about him was just like he really held on to the fact that like I think maybe part of him thought that he could like PR himself out of the mess, that astounding bit of ignorance. And I mean, like, I think like we're maybe seeing like the same thing with like the Democratic Party and how they're like trying to handle Palestine is like, unless there is an about face, there's a 180 in the political discussions that they are having. They are just trying to like eke their way into like enough palatability to be like something that the American government or the American public want. And like, they're not willing to like make that change. They have to hang on to this ideology of like maintaining, obviously this Zionist project, but like it's just like this transformation that could happen, but is just not happening. And that's, looking at Oppenheimer's life, that's really like the point is, before the war, there's a lot of things to think about of like how things would end up afterwards. But after it's already happened, after he's gone through all these hearings time and again, he never has a moment where he says, fuck you guys. And he goes on a scorched earth policy. Like he never does. He just gets defeated and he walks away and then he dies a short while after that. And that's the end of his story. And I think the movie doesn't really get into that, but I think the movie gives you enough like wherewithal in his story that that's kind of the direction it's headed. It's a quiet resolve and it's a like an introspective glance out at a pond, and that's where we end it. And stylistically or historically, different than how it ended in real life, but like thematically, that's exactly what happened. It was just a pensive look out in the distance, and that's the story. That's the wrap on Oppenheimer's life. That's the wrap on Oppenheimer the movie. It's the frustration for like how things could have gone or how things could have been different.
Yeah, there's lots of moments in kind of thinking about his belief. There's lots of moments, especially once he's in America and he's studying at Caltech and Berkeley, and he's kind of involved with, this is where we can also maybe talk some about the communist aspect of it, which we did, I guess, already some. But he's involved with people who are communist. His friends that surrounded him, they're pro-union. They're trying to unionize the people at the university of it. But then he's like playing this constant game of the people within his life that are think he can be much more, saying like, you can't do these communist things because they don't like that. The government doesn't want this. Isn't a good look on you. But then at the same time, he thinks these are the things that people want to look up to him for being part of, having the union, meet in his classroom at Berkeley. And so he very much is constantly like straddling the line of who he wants to please. And I think Obama also like did that too. Like he, I'm gonna please the very liberal or even left leaning people, and then I'm also gonna cozy up to what was it before McConnell, John Boehner when he was in the Congress. And it's the same kind of thing. Like you don't know which way he's gonna go, and inevitably he goes towards the I'm gonna abandon my communist leftist ideas and go and build this bomb. And actually, one of the moments I thought, if you're watching this, you think like this could have been the moment where he said, "Fuck this," is after, I think it's is it in 1944? Well, I guess it's probably the summer of 45 is when Hitler dies. Is it summer of 45? Like
Yeah.
July, is that right? Something like that. April. Okay, so it's a
1945.
little
He
earlier.
dies, and he dies within days of FDR dying, so they happen pretty much at the same time. FDR
Right.
dies of a stroke in Warm Springs, Georgia. I think that's like April 12th, 1945, and then April 15th is like when Hitler decides to off himself. So yeah, no, I think you're right. That's like a very crucial moment where he could be like, okay, and kind of use the bully pulpit to say, well, maybe we shouldn't drop the bomb. But I think that the fact that the United States was still going to be going to war, or was continuing the war against Japan, and this is where we can get into like the official version of history and like how people view that and the perceptions of dropping the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and how there was an official version of that which went through most of the foreign policy establishment, went through the Truman administration. This was the line that was accepted by Truman, his Secretary of State, his other Secretary of State, Dean Acheson, that in order to end the war, in order to end a very bloody, costly, horrific affair in the Pacific, we did this. And yes, it was awful and horrible, and people died, and a lot of people died, but more would have died in the Pacific theater for another year, 2, 3 years of war. That's the argument that they make. The problem with that is that as other writers have sort of researchers have done, and some of this has been sort of synthesized by writers like Gore Vidal, you get a sense that the Japanese were pretty much ready to surrender. They were pretty close by the time you get to the spring and summer 1945. I think that if the United States had done a particular plan of dropping the bomb, where they did sort of what Oppenheimer had kind of in other conversations had suggested they do, which is like drop it off somewhere where there isn't anybody around and just kind of show it off and say, hey, we've got it, but don't hurt anybody, that it might have given us the same desired effect. Or at the very least that, the Trinity test in July of 1945, they filmed it. So like, there's a very real possibility that like, that Truman could like provide copies of that film or screenings of that film to like the Japanese consulate and say like, or the Soviet consulate and say like, hey, and again, this is like a very crucial thing. Cause I'm reading Oppenheimer's book. I read some parts of Dean Acheson's book, called Present at the Creation, which is a very apt title for his memoir for his years at the State Department, because he was present at the creation of the national security state. And also David Halberstam's classic account of the Vietnam War, The Best and the Brightest. You get this real sense that in the American national security state that there are assumptions, that they base their decisions not necessarily upon like clear facts, but upon assumptions. And they make facts fit those assumptions. And so the assumption was, in the summer of 1945, that Japan would not commit to an unconditional surrender, that they would continue fighting, and that if we continued fighting, that more people would die, and especially American soldiers would die, which is obviously the policymakers, those were the ones they cared about. They didn't care about anybody else. So those were the assumptions they went in with. And so they made decisions upon those assumptions without ever getting to the heart of maybe those assumptions are wrong. And even Oppenheimer himself doesn't challenge those assumptions, because at the time his argument is, well, I'm a scientist and these policymakers clearly know about this better than I do. He would learn in a very short amount of time, within basically a year, that was not true. And we can get into that later. But that's, I think, a real challenge. And I think that's the real issue with the American society and the American government today, is that we're very much living with this set of established assumptions that are not allowed to be challenged, that are not allowed to be questioned, that those that question them are then thrown out of government, or they lose their security clearance, or they lose their prestigious university appointments. And those who were wrong and they failed upwards, but they accepted the assumption. They're the ones that get rewarded. And I think that's very true in the case of a character, at least until his failed confirmation to the cabinet of Eisenhower's cabinet. That's the story of Louis Strauss, which we can get into later. This is kind of a guy who sort of fails upward and is wrong on a lot of different things. But because he's accepting the assumptions that the military officials and the national security officials are accepting, he's rewarded. So we often talk about with Oppenheimer like this disconnect from reality with him in terms of his ability to, like, with physics, and that he's sometimes aloof, but it's like there's a huge amount of disconnect from reality when you're in the bubble of what we would call the blob, like the Pentagon, the NSA, the CIA, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the National Security Council. Like, they're in a bubble, and they were in a bubble in 1945. They were in a bubble in 1946. When they denied Oppenheimer's conclusions in the Acheson-Lilienthal report, they did not, and they continue to deny it today. So those are, I think, really problematic. And I think that Eisenhower was somebody. I keep saying that Oppenheimer was somebody who got caught in the crossfire of it, and so those who challenge assumptions get destroyed, and those who accept assumptions and base policy on them get rewarded, and that still happens.
And I think like there's this line you can draw between naming the book, and it's referenced in the story, but of the Prometheus myth, and there is just like this mythical quality, and I think the creation of like the intelligence state coming out of specifically the Pacific theater of World War II and the OST, the precursor to the CIA, being really a big deciding factor in kind of like the narratives that were decided not only in government, but then like carried on through history, is like this kind of, and not that you couldn't make these critiques in other parts of the past, but it really is like this fundamental shift towards creating a security state, like Justin has talked about, but out of a mythical nature. And like the Pacific theater was this perfect example of this, where I think like in some sense the enemy of World War II with Germany was like a highly understandable, like we'd seen them before and paid attention to their rise of power. But in Asia, we just allowed our security state to just tell us without literally any proof or evidence or anything like that. They were just allowed to like basically create policies out of nothing. And that's how we get to the dropping of the bombs, was political, like, sleight of hand is how this kind of came about. And it's something that like even modern historians are still kind of reckoning with it, and it's as specifically, and not just like the profession of historians, but of how like the public understands that history is like, there's still so many people that hold on to this like, well, Japan was never going to surrender if we didn't drop the bombs, and it's like that's ahistorical, and we knew that back then, but this and Oppenheimer's role in that is like all kind of conflated and so completely bastardized that like we have created a separate reality in which we're the good guys, and we can have our arguments in like philosophy 101 classes of like, is dropping a nuclear bomb just war theory, and like that's where we're stuck in this perpetual state of like like sugarcoating everything that happened and not even talking about it in like real historical terms. And that's like the frustrating part of like watching a movie like this, is like, like, especially if you really like have studied these things, that's where it is, and yet we're still like on this like, probably maybe the second bomb was bad, and it's like, oh my god, we're like, the questions we're asking are not even the right ones, and we're so off track.
I think one of the elephants in the room as I watched it the first time in the theater and rewatching it is, at least this is my, like, from readings that I've done on the bombs in Japan, is that, to me, and this is again this is my reading of this and reading of people who said this, the bombs were not to end the war with Japan. The bombs were a warning to the USSR and the Soviet Union and the spread of communism, and they wanted to show the USSR the might that the United States had to prevent them from their spreading of, the Red Scare that came out of this, like the amount of the McCarthyism and all the Red Scare that came from this, which led to Oppenheimer losing a security clearance, sort of, plus also Strauss's, vendetta against him, which I think we should also get to as well. I think that is the number one piece of it. And I think, what's the other thing I was going to mention? And I think that also plays into a lot of the, maybe this is a stupid thought experiment, but I think to myself, if Oppenheimer hadn't been surrounding himself with communists, he had just been a conservative or whatever he was, not a communist, not married to a former communist, and there weren't these questions surrounding it, I think it would have been, I'm not saying that the Red Scare wouldn't have still happened, there was still this fear, but it wouldn't maybe have come out of the Manhattan Project in this, in the same way through the security state. Again, I don't know. Maybe I'm just maybe I'm being naive to say that it wouldn't have been the same way, but yeah.
No, I think some of that's true. I mean, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, the real reason that we dropped the bombs was to work with the Soviets. So, I mean, I think one character of the film who's in it for a very short period, but is extremely important in the history of the era, is Harry Truman. Mm-hmm. So, April 1945, FDR dies. Truman becomes vice president. Truman, up to that point, was pretty much, sort of this crackerjack politician from Missouri, whose main claim to fame was sort of holding defense contractors accountable and overspending during the war as a U.S. senator. It's kind of about it. He was FDR's third vice president, and somebody that he didn't really have much connection to. Essentially, in many ways, he was added to the ticket as a way to placate the South and the more conservative elements of the party, because the previous vice president had been Henry Wallace, and I often think about who might live if in 1945 Henry Wallace had become president instead of Harry Truman. I think we would have lived in a very, very different country, in a very different world. But Harry Truman was somebody who was a deeply ignorant little man, and somebody who was way in over his head. And I think a very modern parallel to him is George W. Bush. And so what Truman does is he surrounds himself with people who are very, very smart to placate the fact that he's in over his head. And one of the ways that he tries to show his dominance is through these big moves that he makes, these big decisions that he often makes to sort of justify his existence as the president, and to say, I'm the guy in charge. And one of them was the dropping of the bombings on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. They happen in July of 1945, around the time of the Potsdam Conference, which happens in Germany. It's about the setting up of the post-war Europe, and it's a meeting with Truman, Churchill, and Stalin. And once General Groves, in the movie, he's like, get Truman on the phone. I'm going to call him after the Trinity test works. Truman, there's stories about him being absolutely elated and basically not saying everything to the Soviets, and then basically kind of being a dick to Stalin, like the rest of the Potsdam Conference, kind of treating him like he's lesser than, because Truman's like, well, I have this now and I can play with this. And so, FDR was not the kind of political figure like that. He had much more finesse. He was much more subtle, and he was much more internationalist in outlook. And that's not to say the Cold War wouldn't have happened at all. I think it still would have. But I think about it often. If Roosevelt had lived, or if Wallace had been president, would we have dropped the bombs? And I think a very good answer is probably no. I don't think it would have happened, or at the very least, it wouldn't have happened the way it did. It was a very clear signal to not just the Soviets, but to the world, who was going to be in charge of the world order post-World War II. And it's truly the peak of the 20th century manifestation of the American empire. And you follow us, or if you don't, you know what we did, and we will do it to you. So that's really I think that's a big element of it. Yeah.
Well, and I think, like, you talk about, like, how could we have avoided the Cold War? And it's really like, there's not really a clear answer, but there is a perspective of, like, the most instrumental thing in starting the Cold War was obviously like the nuclear power was really like what put it into overdrive and what got it started immediately, and obviously what was, the preeminent purpose of dropping the bombs in general. And I think like, I think people want to blame only the nuclear bombs, and that's not exactly true, but there is just almost like this comical thing of like looking back at history and realizing like the destructive power of the United States in a confrontation to Russia at the time, or the USSR, but like it was realized like we were committing absolute atrocities, but like the mythic nature of what really like makes people believe in the American empire is like it's the nuclear bomb. It's like what made us believe like that the America like was the preeminent superpower. And I think like that's still like when we talk about like history and stuff, and it's like there's still people like not really capturing how much of a role Russia played in World War II. And I think it's literally just because of the nuclear bomb. It's because like, ooh, big bomb mean we powerful, and it's like, oh no, we killed triple that amount in like a day and a half using firebombing Tokyo. And like that's not a thing that we conceive of, but because we had this like literal mythical power in the nuclear bomb at the very end of the war, but the very start of the empire, you allow people to like just create an empire out of nothing, but like it just lays the foundation for things to go absolutely wild from that point on.
This reminds me, Nathan, of, I was just trying to pull it up. If you look at, there's these polls, I think it's by Gallup, about, who they said won who was instrumental in winning World War II. And right afterwards, it was something like 65% said the Soviet Union. But when you ask that same question in the early 2000s, it's the opposite. It's 65% say America. And people remember the bomb. They don't remember the Soviet Union did against the Germans, causing, 40 million of their people dying. And, and we don't have to go down the rabbit hole of World War II and all of this, but certainly the U.S. decision to not enter the war and let the Soviet Union fight on was to weaken them. And what better way for the U.S. to show their strength than dropping a bomb that they just spent, $3 billion building, something like that, they say. And then in today's dollars, it was like $67 billion. That's just a phenomenal amount of money.
Yeah, I think there's also, and Justin, you might have like a book reference for this. I don't have a specific one, but there's really something to say, and I'm sure poets have said it and said it much better than I can. But of the Cold War being bookended by the nuclear bomb, and then the Chernobyl collapse is kind of where we see kind of the end stage of, and it's the story of nuclear power. And it's just one of those things that you like, if you view it, you could have a nuclear history of the second half of the 20th century, and you could really tell a pretty complete story of how we got here and the political machinations that moved governments, and how it even led to like deep-seated distrust and ignorance in governments. And it's horrifying, but it really is. I think that's why I latched on to loving Oppenheimer as the movie so much, is because it's telling that story, and maybe not as explicitly, and obviously it never touches on Chernobyl, but it really does. It's that start of the story, and there's so much that can be learned just from like viewing history through that kind of lens.
Yeah, I think so. I agree. And in terms of like the books, I mean, like for me at least, I mean, the book that I read in college was, when I took a course on the history of the Soviet Union, was Stephen Kotkin's book Armageddon Averted. And it does talk about how Chernobyl is a very clear event of the Soviet state apparatus no longer being able to withstand the level of disconnect between what they're saying policy-wise and what's actually happening. And yes, Chernobyl was an awful event and horrific. And I think your framing of it, sort of bookending the end of the Cold War, is a very apt one, and I think a very insightful one. I think that when it comes to Oppenheimer, he's a figure who is deeply haunted by the things that he did. But at the same time, it made him it made him an influential figure, right? Like, most of the policy discussions that happen when they go into Secretary of Defense's office, Secretary Stimson in the movie, they kind of have those conversations, and he sort of relays. So it's like he sort of does it in this sort of third party indirect way where he never says like, this is what I think we should do. He's like, well, I have some of my team who think this, I have some of my team who think that, these are the various approaches, and we're going to provide guidance, and then you ultimately make the decisions. And, for most of those early years of the end of the World War II, he sort of creates sort of drafts of policy, presents them to policymakers, and then policymakers often make choices. And the choices are often pretty bad. And then he's like, well, what the hell? Like, I gave them the right path here. I thought this through, and so did my colleagues and I, like we all did. And they still didn't do it. And so I think he gets this disillusionment. And I think that's part of the reason why he's so kind of resigned to his fate in front of the gray board in 1954, and why he sort of goes off in the sunset. It's a form of penance maybe, but it's also a part of him recognizes that these people are going to do what they're going to do regardless of what I say. And yeah, I could tell them to go to hell. I could do that. And Einstein told him to, but he kind of took it anyway. And I think that speaks volumes about him and how much he actually like genuinely kind of loved America. Like, I think that's like, he loved his country. Right. And so, there's that great scene in the movie where he's talking to Einstein, and he's like, you shouldn't take, Einstein's like, you tell me to hell or whatever, and you don't know your country anything, whatever. And Oppenheimer's like, well, God damn it, I love my country. I love this country. Right. So there's this real push and pull between, as any loyal soldier would, and this is how they treat me. And I think that's just him reckoning with the fact that there are forces much larger than all of us that make choices that have very little input from the public and very little input from policymakers themselves, the people who should know better and do know better. And that's a consequence. Those are consequences I think we're living with to this day, and why I think people are so cynical about politics, as you mentioned, Nathan, because they just see that disconnect all the time. They see people doing insane things for insane ends, and they just go, why, And I think for us the answer is fairly simple, which is to maintain the American empire. It's to maintain the hegemonic status the United States has. But you can't say that out loud because you can't be president and say, yeah, we are maintaining the empire. You can't do that. So it's I think that's really distressing because people know the truth. They know the real issues, but they don't get articulated by policymakers. And that's frustrating as hell.
I think it's a really interesting thing. I don't think you've ever covered it, Evan, but like the two kind of World War II biopics that we've had in the last few years with Imitation Game and now Oppenheimer is like the story of two people that were ultimately like incredibly instrumentive in the war process, like, and these huge, like, almost world-defining geniuses, and yet both kind of ignorant of how the government works, but also they were just pawns. And I think like that's just like one reflection to have, and like you can talk about Oppenheimer and Alan Turing's like specific roles and those types of things and like how they perceive government. But it's like, I think another way to view it is to view like any figure, no matter how important or how instrumental or how foundational to the start of something. I mean, Oppenheimer invented nuclear war and nuclear technology, invented early computers, and yet like they created the modern world out of the two of them, and yet, I mean, they were just kind of just thrown to the wayside of history. And like, that's just what that is what an empire has to do in order to sustain itself, in order to grow, in order to maintain it. You absolutely must treat any person as just a pawn in the game. And I think like that's one of the things is talking about like the really like the birth of like the CIA and the security state. And it's not like the most perfect book, but it's the book on the invention of or like the Dulles brothers and stuff by
I like that book.
Yeah, it's a great way to view history because it really gets at like the gamification of these like entities, like that they really are like truly playing a game, and we are all kind of pawns, but like really specific people are you could not describe them as anything other than a pawn in their game, and that's all that matters. And Oppenheimer and Alan Turing are the just the shining examples of that as like a historical lesson.
Well, I think people like Oppenheimer and, Turing and these other, great minds were thinking they had a singular focus to build something specific. Whereas you think about, like, as the Dulles Brothers is a good example, is they were not thinking, okay, I'm going to make this bomb and then this bomb is going to do this thing. They're thinking of all the different webs across the world. I mean, you look at the Dulles Brothers and all of the, you can look at other books and look in the index and see their name. They're on everything. Their mark is on so many parts of foreign policy and just evil across the world, is that they were playing a game that Oppenheimer didn't know existed. Like he's playing checkers and these guys are playing, 4D chess or whatever. I don't know, something way harder than checkers or something. But it's kind of amazing when you kind of look at it in a way how ignorant Oppenheimer. We said this, throughout this, but is he just didn't. That wasn't an interest of his. And actually, I thought a good metaphor for this when you both were talking is when they first get to Los Alamos and Oppenheimer has on the army kind of camouflage green suit, and one of his I don't which is the doctor who said he should take it off.
It's Robbie. It's
yes.
Isidore Robbie.
Right. Who is one of the better, characters in this as far as kind of the really grappling with the nature of how what this would mean. But he's like, this isn't
masterfully played by David Krumholtz, by the way.
Oh, wonderful. He was wonderful in this. Yes. I mean, there's so many great performances across the board, but he takes it off, and because that's not him. He can't take the persona of the military because he doesn't understand it. He can't be it. He was just an imposter in that uniform. He had to be the guy with the hat and the pipe. That's him. And it's a good choice. Like, that whole scene is, movie-wise, it's a great scene.
It's a very, very great scene, and it reminds me, like, weirdly enough, because like that scene is, and I can't help this because like we are all people who have lived in the ether of superhero movies for our entire lives. So like, it's his like superhero moment where like, he takes off the the fake identity and puts on the real one, right? So it's like Batman, right? The real person's not Bruce Wayne. The real person is Batman. When he puts on the Batman suit, that's who he really is, right? Which is apt because, of course, Nolan made the best Batman movies that have still yet been made. And I think it's the same thing with Oppenheimer, right? Like, he's got this like false identity wearing this suit. And then you have that kind of moment where the music kind of swells and you see him in his office and he's putting on that gray suit and he's got the pork pie hat. And he's got the pipe, and you're like, now he's the man. He's the epic hero, right? He's going on the journey of self-discovery. It's his like Superman Fortress of Solitude moment. And I couldn't help but see it that way, because that's how the movie kind of wants you to see it that way. The movie does a really good balance between sort of giving you moments of his like peak success or heroism or whatever, and then mixed with like personal failings and like deep regrets and deep depression and frustrations and second thoughts and misgivings. And I kind of like that, because that shows complexities of human beings. Not all of us are heroes or villains. Most of us are somewhere in between. And that's kind of who Oppenheimer was.
Oppenheimer was really just a incredibly palatable, but also like iconic figure. And he's talking about like just like how he dressed, and like his literal aesthetics was like, he was a perfect representation of what the Empire, how they needed a propaganda piece to work. I mean, he was attractive, he was well spoken, he perfectly fit the mold of what he needed to be. The only thing I would say about the aesthetics of Oppenheimer specifically, gorgeous man. He smoked a lot more in real life than he did in the movie. Like, he was just, that was like, it was something he was just known for. He was just never not puffing on his pipe, like, ever in his life.
I mean, even the cover of American Prometheus, like this iconic picture, he's got a cigarette in his mouth. Like, and that's ultimately what he dies of. In 1967, he dies of esophageal cancer. I think I think that we can maybe talk a little bit about like the actors and stuff. I mean, Cillian Murphy's performance is incredible. I think barring some weird fluke, he's going to end up winning Best Actor at the Oscars. I think Oppenheimer's going to sweep the Oscars. I just do, just based on it winning everywhere else. But and I'm okay with that. But yeah, the stuff that I really loved. As somebody who's kind of a like physical film, like real analog film geek, in my day job, I work with newspaper digitization. I'm knee deep in microfilm all the time. Microfilm is amazing. It's still the best way to preserve newspapers and any sort of documents. It's still the best way to preserve them long term. And just knowing that this movie was shot on 70 millimeter IMAX, 65 millimeter black and white, which they had to literally reinvent because they didn't make 65 millimeter black and white for years. And so they called Kodak and they're like, can you do that? And Kodak's like, we'll try. And so they were able to basically reinvent a technology to get the black and white that they wanted. The fact that they edited it in can, like they edited it in the editing bays where they physically cut the negatives and spliced them together. There's something about that give this movie an extremely visceral quality. It looks like a movie that could have been made, maybe 20, 30 years ago, or 40 or 50 or 60 years ago. It has that kind of quality of feeling so visceral and real, and all the practical effects. Like the scene where Oppenheimer's laying in bed as a young man studying at university, and he's having those visions of those like things spinning around him. Most people assume, oh, they put that in post. No, that was a physical thing that they spun around Cillian Murphy's face and got on camera. And I'm like blown away by that. I mean, I think that, in an age where movies, honestly, you're kind of blown away by movies that cost so much and yet look so bad. Like a lot of these Marvel movies are like $150 million, $200 million movies, and they look like garbage, and like that Christopher Nolan was able to make a 3-hour epic on 70 millimeter IMAX, 65 millimeter black and white, standard Panavision for a lot of the other scenes, and was able to make this utter masterpiece on $100 million. It's like, it's a great example of like, hey guys, those big bloated budgets you have in Hollywood? You don't need them, because Christopher Nolan made something like this with a third of the money we gave you. So what can you do? And so the fact of the physical film, and is such a physical film geek. I love the fact that he keeps film alive. Him, Scorsese, Spielberg, like they're the guys who keep physical film alive, because otherwise movies just kind of like expensive TV shows now. Oppenheimer's like the first movie I've seen in years that looks like a real movie. Like, and I'm kind of like impressed by that part of it, technically.
And I also think there's not enough can be said about just like how good of a movie going experience Oppenheimer is. Like if you saw it in the IMAX, you got all the sound, you got like the audience anticipation, and especially how the movie is paced. It's just like, it's a fast 3-hour movie, and you never like get bored. And I think I just watched Dune this weekend too, and it's just like, this is what going to the movies, like this is the magic of what movies can be. Like this is when I watched Oppenheimer again at home, and it's a good movie. I really enjoyed it, but like nothing can beat like watching it in IMAX. And I mean, I think like ultimately we don't get those at a lot of big budget stuff anymore. And a lot of people watched, even Scorsese's new movie, a lot of people watched it at home, and like that's just, I don't know, there's something that's hard to define, I guess, in some sense, but just like going to the movie theater to see something and being like totally in the moment and like alive with the movie is such a fun thing. And you know what? It's cool that Barbenheimer was a thing, if only for the sake of like it got people to like really care about semi-original story. I mean, they're based off of IP and based off a real person, but getting people to like care about things and have, I don't know, like cultural touchstones that literally aren't just Star Wars episode 45. Like it's a good thing. Like I feel a little hope.
Film 206. Yeah. I agree with you about the Barbenheimer phenomenon. I think that unfortunately I do genuinely believe Hollywood will take all the wrong lessons from it, which is, crappy, because I think that they'll be like, well, now we just need like more Barbie movies, or like now we need to make like a Ken movie, and like they'll do that instead of like, no, what you need to do is empower filmmakers to make really interesting film, and not focus group them to death, and let them make the movie they want to make. And I think that it's the Christopher Nolan is one of the few people now who can like sell a movie on him making it, right? Most people, most directors now, it's the way that the main like big budget Hollywood movies are now. It's very similar to like the studio system in like the 30s and the 40s and 50s, where the director doesn't matter all that much. They often will hire people who've made like a small movie, and then it's like, okay, we're going to hire you to make Ant-Man 4 or whatever, right? And it's kind of one of the few people who can like sell a movie on his name. Or it's like Scorsese can do that, Steven Spielberg can do that, and to a greater or lesser extent, Greta Gerwig can do that, right? Because I think part of it was the fact that she was doing it. Because there's definitely a version of Barbie that would have been god awful, but it was pretty decent. Yeah, the Amy Schumer version I think it would have been absolutely atrocious. First off, it would have been this like, instead of a deconstruction of what Barbie is, which the actual movie kind of gets into, it would just be a movie that would, I think, kind of just take a big shit on Barbie like for 2 hours. And I don't think people wanted to watch that. And I think, I liked Barbie. This is like my quick little thing about how I feel about Barbie, but like the movie's all right. I think it's pretty good. I think it's a little long. I think there are moments where it's a bit self-indulgent, but I think you have a right if you're making a movie about Barbie and your first person ever make a movie about Barbie. And it's not made for me. That's the other thing I have to remind myself. I'm a 33-year-old man. It's not made for me. So I have to, I think that if people were going to study me and who I am as a person and said, okay, what kind of summer movie could get me to the theater? They would have come up with Oppenheimer. It's this big budget. It's Christopher Nolan. It's about a historical subject. It has beautiful visual effects. It's everything I like as a person, and as a person who loves watching movies. So it's very rare when you get to see a movie like that on screen. You're like, this feels like it was made for me.
Yeah, I think one thing too, and then we can, we can wrap on this. I just would just add that I think as far as even just the movies that are nominated for Best Picture, I think you do actually see a lot of movies that are different than maybe you would normally get. I think of Poor Things as just being kind of a crazy kind of visual. We don't have to go down all these movies. The Zone of Interest, which is just a stunning achievement. I think there are a lot of these movies now. And maybe it's just that this year I'm paying even extra close attention than normal, but it seems like there really is this attention to making a lot of interesting kinds of movies. I'm sick of if they never made another Marvel movie, I would dance in the street. I agree. I could be happy with that. But as far as Oppenheimer is concerned, I also felt like I loved it in the theater. I enjoyed it at home, but it like lacked that experience, and that's just the nature of a movie like this. But I don't think I have anything less. I think you could easily spend another multiple hours going into other aspects of this movie, because it's 3 hours. We didn't even there's things about Strauss you could go into, like the black and white scenes I think are beautifully shot. And it's interesting how they chose to the latest part of the movie is the part that's shot in black and white, which also is an interesting choice, but also kind of separates the narrative, which is cool. But I don't know if either had any last thoughts on it. And I guess also, I think I told everyone where your podcasts are, but if you have any last bits.
No, I just got to say, those baby blues, is a good looking man. That's really, I think, worth the ticket price for that alone.
Yeah. Cillian Murphy was stunning.
Yeah, it's the performance of his career. It's there's this picture that somebody took of when they were like the shooting script for Oppenheimer, and Christopher Nolan put a little post-it note on it for him, and it says Cillian, this is your time to be the lead. Love, Chris. And it's yeah, dude, Cillian Murphy's a dude who's earned it. I've never seen him be bad in a movie. The late great Christopher Lee once said that you're going to be in a lot of bad movies as an actor. The point is not to be bad in them. And I think that applies to Cillian Murphy. I've seen him in movies that aren't that great, and he's still very, very good at them. And I think that the supporting cast is incredible. Robert Downey Jr. is amazing in this movie. I was so worried post Marvel that his career would really go off the rails. And for a little while there, I think we were all worried about it. I know I was, with the whole like Doolittle situation. But him doing this role and being Louis Strauss, I'm like, oh yeah, like Robert Downey Jr. is a monster fucking actor. Like, and so we didn't get to see that for 10 years. And so it's just great to see him actually being an actor and really, really good. Excellent supporting cast. I can't speak volumes. I mean, obviously, like David Krumholtz, Emily Blunt, Florence Pugh. I mean, Matthew Modine. I always love Matthew Modine when he shows up in anything. Matt Damon as Leslie Groves is good. I mean, it's every few scenes you're like, oh shit, there's Alden Ehrenreich, and then you're like, oh shit, there's David Krumholtz. It's one of those fun movies where you get to see all your like favorite character actors being in this like kind of masterpiece. The only one I don't feel great about is Casey Affleck, which I'm kind of like, I have kind of the ick factor with him, but he also plays a piece of shit, so it's like, it's not that bad. He plays Boris Pash, who's fun. Yeah, but anyway, yeah, I think Oppenheimer is like, for me, it's my favorite biopic that I have seen since Spielberg's Lincoln, which is one of my other favorite biopics. I love Lincoln. Again, another movie that if they were to design in a lab for me to love, they nailed it. As somebody who's been studying Abraham Lincoln since a little kid. But yeah, no, I think it's a masterful piece. I think that it might be Christopher Nolan's best movie. I think it is. I think that, and I think that, yeah, I think it's a stunning achievement, and it's rare in Hollywood these days to have something just be universally this much of an achievement.
Agreed. But yeah, so if you haven't seen it yet, we didn't really. I mean, we talked about the movie a lot, but kind of, as part of the politics around it. Certainly, you could probably just talk about the cinematography and the politics of Nolan and lots of things. You could go 3 hours on it, but Justin and Nathan, thank you for sticking it out here, and Nathan for patiently waiting about 9 months to finally do the Oppenheimer.
I hope this is clipped. I got to put it on TikTok. People have been asking me for months why I thought this was a climate change movie, and I'm ready to tell the world, but I had to do it here first.
Okay, well, I appreciate you holding out on that. Yeah, I certainly can cut that. I flagged it too, so we'll. But yeah, thank you both for taking the time, and been great.
Thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
Awesome. Well, you can catch the podcast wherever you can catch podcasts, and we'll catch you next time.